Hey, what's up, guys? John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime here. Thanks for checking out the video. What we're going to do this week is a similar format to last week, and I'm going to continue to do more of this if I continue to get good positive feedback. But hey, the feedback was great, and what we're going to do this week is go over some hands from 500 Zoom that I saved. I just kind of kept the lobby open for about a day and a half and observed some tables and went back and just scrolled through the biggest pots that were played over like a 36-hour stretch. And I thought it would be fun to go over, and the reason I looked at the biggest pots was I thought it would be good to talk about playing deep stacked, right? There's a lot of good players at 500 Zoom, but I was kind of shocked to see some mistakes made by some of these players. And I think that just playing deep stacked is something that a lot of players write in about. Nothing feels worse, of course, than getting stacked in like a 500 big blind pot and not knowing if your stack off was correct. And the other side of that is nobody wants to be that player who, when gets 100 big blinds or 200 big blinds and then just knits it up and feels like they're not applying enough pressure. So there's a balance there, right? Like we don't want to be that player who gets really deep and spews, but we also don't want to be that player who, runs good, builds up a monster stack, and then doesn't know how to wield it. So today, we're going to just go through like 4 or 5 hand histories where we're looking at some deep stack situations. But we'll get into that in a moment. This hand is not a deep stacked hand, but it was a hand that happened that I thought was interesting. So I thought that we would talk about. So we see here that it's a blind versus blind situation. This player, Play It Smart, who I don't have any reads on, I don't know who he is, opens and gets called in the big blind by Seuss Sios. I don't know how to say his name, but I do recognize him. He's been around for a long time. As far as I know, he's a good regular. I know that he's played some high stakes games before. And in fact, I think he used to be the Deuces Cracked coach. I don't know if he still is, but from what I know, he's a very good player. So folds to the small blind. He opens pre-flop, gets called by, we'll call him Seuss, in the big blind. Comes 7-7-3 two-tone, checks through. This player leads on the turn, and for about half pot and gets called. River's a king, filling the flush, and we've got a 2 pair on the board. This is a lot of stuff out there, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting. Everything up to this point has been pretty standard so far. Play It Smart checks. Seuss bets almost the pot, right? 56, 66 into 59 and change. Play It Smart thinks for a while, and check raises for the pot. Holy shit. All right, so this is one of my favorite parts about playing 6-max. And something that makes 6-max unique is that there's a lot of positional dynamics in the sense that, there's cutoff versus button dynamics, there's button versus small blind dynamics, there's blind versus blind dynamics, and you just develop all of these different dynamics based on position and based on who the opponents are. And blind versus blind is just one of the spots where players kind of go to war. Of course, like in heads-up pots, it's hard to have the nuts. So you'll see a lot of big bluffs, and likewise, you'll see, especially in the more aggressive dynamics, you're going to see people's value ranges widen considerably. Now, this is an interesting situation because, in general, I think it's the standard is for people, since they know that dynamics are very aggressive blind versus blind, it's normal on these paired boards for people to fear getting check raised. So I think that when like Seuss checks back the flop, he's definitely got like a lot of medium strength hands. Everybody's definition of a medium strength hand is going to be different on this board. But I think that a lot of checking back ranges will be like, some like bare flush draws. Against more straightforward opponents, I think that you can still bet those pretty confidently and expect a lot of folds. But in today's games, like you'll see a lot of players checking back like bare flush draws or some overpairs, and a variety of other hands. But I think that in general, when I see a good player checking back this flop, unless they're more straightforward than most. Like I think that they have a medium strength hand. And we can also narrow his range a little bit more further because he called a turn bet, right? So you would imagine if he had complete garbage, like let's say he had like queen 9, 6 deuce double suited, just as a random example. He would have just folded to a turn bet, right? But now, like once he calls the turn, like you can be pretty confident that he's got a medium strength hand. And I think that a common mistake that players make is trying to, and is when it's clear that someone has a medium strength hand, only firing one to make them fold. And I used to burn a lot of bets like that. I used to just kind of, the flop would check through and I would just sort of stab at the pot because, well, what the hell, like everybody checked, I'm going to just bet. And I think now I typically save a lot of bets like that because I recognize more when people have medium strength hands. And I also recognize when fold frequencies are really low, especially in these like single raised pots when it's so easy for people to just call one or even two bets. So in general, like I think that if this player in the small blind was just betting like one as a bluff to be done, I'm not a big fan of it. I would rather just check and give up. I think that that's better against this player. Now against someone more straightforward, sure, you can bet and take it down. But here, like, it's pretty interesting, right? Like, I think that Seuss can be betting a lot of different hands for value just because it's really difficult, especially on a board like this, for the small blind player to have. It's difficult for him to like have anything connected to that board, so you can especially given the action, you can value bet pretty confidently. Not to mention that I think that this is also a line where, especially if you're a good player, you can have perceived bluffs. So he can value bet widely, and he's, of course, like very polarized with this bet, but he could still have medium strength hands in his range. Now, it's one of those situations where if you're betting like, let's say that you have like let's say he has just like trip threes, or he has a flush on this river. I mean, you're pretty happy to value bet it, but then when you get check raised, you're kind of regretting betting in the first place. But let's think through this hand, right? Like, first of all, the first thing you have to realize or you have to think about is what your opponent's representing. Here, basically, Play It Smart's representing exactly King's full. I think that for the most part, as played, he probably would just check call with trip sevens. Most players aren't going to just like turn trip sevens into a bluff. So that's pretty much it. Like I actually think that he's played it a lot like King's full. Some players, I do think that it would be a pretty cool play to like take this line with the nut flush. But I think that most players probably aren't doing that. Like I said, it's hard for me to tell without knowing this Play It Smart guy. But I think that what was crossing Seuss's mind was just, how often does this player river King's full? B, would he play King's full this way? And C, is he capable of like turning a king blocker into a bluff? I guess, and also D, like, is he capable of value betting wider than King's full? But he does decide to make the call, and it's pretty cool. Like, this player, actually, I think that this player read it very well. Like, he realized that his king was no good, and he tried to turn it into a bluff. Again, like, this is just sort of like a function of, like, the pot's just like wasn't he basically the pot was too small. It started out too small in order for him to like get Seuss to fold. But Seuss actually like bet calls the river with the second nut flush. So I think it was pretty like well played by both players. Play It Smart's, some people might think that Play It Smart's bluff on the river was not great, but hey, he had a lot of heart, and I think that Seuss had even just a little bit more heart. So cool hand on both sides. So in this next hand, we've got an under the gun open from Nino Pino, who's very deep. We get a 3-bet from Big Bob in under the gun +1, and these are always interesting situations. I think when you're facing an open, typically players' ranges are very tight from under the gun +1. So like when under the gun opens and under the gun +1 like calls, it's usually like strong big carded hands, right? In 6 max. But you do see a lot, especially as players start to get deeper, you do see a lot of 3-bets in that scenario, just because typically it takes a very strong hand to 4-bet behind. And also you'll see a lot of players who will 3-bet in this scenario with like rundowns that play well in position facing a 4-bet because, hey, the odds of getting 4-bet are higher when you're facing an under the gun open. But at the same time, like especially when stacks get deeper, I mean, granted, like under the gun +1 isn't very deep here. Players will like not 4-bet as much because they're deeper stacked. They want to keep their range disguised. So as stacks get deeper, you see this kind of like 3-bet scenario a little bit more often. So we see a cold call on the button, which given the stacks, I think that his range could be wider than usual, right? Like if everybody was playing 100 big blinds here, like normally the range that calls on the button is like good rundowns, like, Jack 10, 9, 8s of the world, Ace, King, Jack 10 with a suit or double suited of the world, or like double paired hands that, are capable of calling a 4-bet from under the gun, but also are happy to see like a 3-way pot in position. So I think that like you're not going to see a lot of low cards, but you're going to see certainly like a lot of strong rundowns in people's cold calling ranges here. So we see a call from the end of the gun player. It comes Ace 7, 3, 2 hearts. Checks to the button, who bets 120 and gets check raised by the end of the gun player. Okay, so now it's like this. It's like hand reading / decision time, right? So it's tough for me to know some specifics. I don't have these players' HUD stats. I don't recognize any of these players. So I don't know what kind of dynamic they have. I don't know like their general reputations. But one thing that I want, the reason why I included this hand and I wanted to bring it up was 2 things. One being, as stacks get deeper, you're going to see a lot fewer 4-bets with aces, especially bad aces. So, when you have when the flop comes something like this and you have a hand like, let's say like Ace 3 or Ace 7 or like an ace in side cards, your hand goes down a lot in value. Not to say that they're not strong hands, but you have to recognize that people certainly have like top sets more in their range. Secondly, like when stacks are much deeper, people's check raising ranges on this board are much stronger than in a normal 3-bet pot. So, in a 100 big blind situation, people can have like, any pair in a flush draw, 4, 5, 6 with a flush draw, and any 2 pair are the nuts. But when people get deeper, they certainly play those more passively. So it's important to notice that tendency. And so when you see somebody like check raise this flop, I just think it's the nut. It's like top set of an extremely high percentage of the time. So frankly, and the reason why I showed this is because you see here, like Pejak poker, he certainly has a good hand, right? Top pair, Ace King, like top pair and kickers with the nut flush draw. And not to say that I would check this back, but there's really no reason to jam. I mean, I think that because of how deep everyone is, like this is an easy jam when you're 100 big blinds in a 3-bet pot. But when it's this deep, I think that I just prefer a call of the check raise. There's just no reason to stick it in against a very top set heavy range. And the one on the other end of it, a lot of people will say, oh, but like there's an ace on the board and I have an ace. It's very unlikely that he has top set. But remember what I said about people when the stacks are this deep, they're not going to just be 4-betting all of their aces combinations. They're going to have some of their aces combinations in their appealing range pre. So I just thought that like this is a common mistake that I see is on these boards, players overvaluing this type of hand when people's ranges are so set heavy. So, be aware of that. And we see that he does get lucky and he scoops like a 640 big blind pot. So nice hand there. Okay, so here we've got a hand where a guy with 260 big blinds opens under the gun and gets 3-bet by another guy with 260 big blinds from middle position. Again, like I don't recognize these names or don't know, like, I don't know. I mean, they're familiar, but I don't have like any particular reads on these players. So the end of the gun player calls, and this player donks for close to pot. And all right, so this is a play that you don't see very often, right? For a couple of reasons. One being, You know, uh, well, under the gun versus or middle position versus under the gun ranges, especially three betting, are typically pretty strong, right? That's one, and most people, with good reason, don't just donk into strong pre-flop ranges. So that's one reason. Second reason I would say is that a lot of people just they play back a lot against donk bets. So when unless you're super nutted, you don't necessarily want people to be like calling you in position, because playing on later streets can be a challenge. So I mean, the way that I view donk bets is they can be difficult to play against sometimes, right? Like everybody's had those situations where they're playing some crazy donk and he just keeps like donk betting into them. And it can be hard to handle, especially when you don't have a hand and you feel like you're getting kind of exploited when they're constantly stealing pots from you when you're in position. And it always feels kind of, and it's kind of irritating because, hey, you're in position. This should be your turn to put in a C bet or at least see a turn. And they're taking that away from you. So in that way, donk bets can be, they can be effective. And there's certainly like a time and a place for donk betting. But in general, like, I don't think that I would have much of a donk betting range here. And I think that most good players are probably like that. I just think that you get played back at so much. And, there might be cases where I might take an unconventional line with by donk betting here. But in general, like, I think that I would do it with something very strong, and I'd be doing it for the purpose of inducing. So if I happen to flop a set, and I thought I was going to get played back out a lot, I would do it. But I think that in general, I'm checking here. But we do see the cutoff call. Turn brings an 8. This player pots it again. This guy rips it in. And he calls. So we're going to look at their hands real quick so we can talk about kind of like everybody's play here. So actually, I didn't remember like what the end of the gun player had, but I did remember what the cutoff had. So a couple of things, right? One being, what do we think about the pre-flop 3-bet from the guy with aces? I think that it's pretty standard. I mean, of course, like a re-raised pot in position when you're deep stacked with single suited, reasonable, like these are decent aces, is going to show a profit in the long run. But again, like, I think that people overestimate, or I should say they underestimate people's range strength for putting in a lot of money when stacks are this deep. We saw in the previous hand where it came ace-7-3, and I was mentioning how people's getting it in ranges are just so much stronger when deep stacked. And I think that, like, the guy in the cutoff probably thought, hey, I put him on a draw, like, I'm all in. But I think that if somebody had, let's say they have like an overpair, let's say they have like kings with a flush draw, or they have like a 7 with a flush draw, or like a queen with a flush draw. I just don't think that when people are deeper that they play it this fast, right? So I think that the better play is definitely to just peel in position and play a river rather than just sticking it in. And I think that sticking it in kind of eliminates the benefit of being in position. So I think that, again, like the reason I included this hand was, I guess, to talk a little bit about the pre-flop 3-bet. Like, I think it's pretty standard, and I think that, of course, like, calling the flop is mandatory, but be careful about just ripping it in with something like this when stacks are much deeper, because people's ranges change and they're a lot stronger. So be sure to watch out for that. And we see he actually wins on both runs. So cool. Another nice pot for that player. So here under the gun, another player who I'm not sure who he is, opens and he's got 200 big blinds and gets 3-bet by another player who I'm not sure of. Odds compile. And then Odd Odson, who is a very well-known high-stakes regular, cold 4-bets from the button. And I actually played with, I don't really know how to say his name, but Ola is his first name. I played with him in the 25K PLO this year. I thought he played very well. And just, I'm sure like all of these players know who he is. In general, depending on what the dynamic is with these players, Odd Odson could have a variety of different hands. I think that in general, he's going to be closer to like a strong value hand. So not necessarily all combinations of aces, but he's certainly going to have like all single suited aces, strong dominating rundowns, and some double suited kings type hands. And we see odds compile call. Flop comes Jack 6-7 two-tone. And this is a board that really kind of favors the under the gun +1 range. Similar to the scenario that I was talking about earlier where, in the dynamic of under the gun +1, especially as stacks get deeper, you're going to see a lot lighter 3-bets because, again, like it takes a strong hand to 4-bet from behind. And when stacks are deeper, you can actually call 4-bets a lot more profitably. So you're going to see, especially if like under the gun is a weak player or something like that, a lot of good players will start to really widen their 3-betting range to include more rundowns, to include even a lot more pairs than they would at 100 big blinds. Pairs are, especially like double suited ace-x type hands, or like just a variety of other paired hands that you couldn't profitably call a 4-bet with at 100 big blinds. You'll start to see people like 3-betting when they get deeper because they have more implied odds. So now, if what I said is true about Odd Odson's preflop range, that it's mostly big card heavy, this is a board that he's not really going to, given the stacks, like he doesn't necessarily want to just like be bet and getting it in. He'd rather check back and probably see like a clean turn. And it's a good SPR for that. So I would imagine you see a lot of checkbacks here. So it does go check, check. Turn is the 9 of diamonds. Check, check again. And I think it's just a situation where Odd Odson can still he can pot control and call a lot of river bets, and he doesn't risk getting check raised. And especially if he does have a flush, or I think that most of his hands that turn to straight, let's say he has 8-10, probably would have bet the flop. If he has ace 8-10 or king 8-10 or something like that, or king 8-5, anything that contains a straight draw on the flop, he would have bet. So I think that for the most part, he's pretty polarized to overpairs, and potentially he could have, if he had some type of hand on the flop where it was just a naked flush draw. Let's say he somehow had ace king. I'm trying to think of a hand that had contained a flush draw that he would check back. He would 4-bet pre-flop, but that would check back the flop. I guess it's possible, but I think most of his hands that were good enough to 4-bet pre and that contained a flush draw would just bet the flop and get it in. But you never know sometimes. And I would say that most good players are pretty polar in these situations. Generally, I would say that he would bet the flop with his air, bet the turn with his air. But given that he didn't bet the flop, he might just think that he can't get credit for anything, so he's going to get played back out a lot. So you will see some players just be giving up now, since the board is pretty bad for him. But similar to the other hand where we saw Seuss pot the river with his value range, we see a very polarized pot-sized river bet here, but on a pretty different board, I think, given what the run-out is. So there's a couple of things that work here. One is that some players who are in under the gun's shoes can think, well, let's rewind a little bit. Remember earlier I said that most good players, when they check, it actually means that they have something, rather than typically bad players, when they check, it means that they're giving up. So good players, there starts to be a leveling war where, is he bombing it because he's trying to get me to fold a medium strength hand? Or is he bombing it because he knows I have a medium strength hand and he's trying to get me to call? And I would imagine that Odd Odson can, or he thinks that he should call this river because of his line, right? Given what I said, it clearly looks, it's clear that he doesn't have a flush. It's clear that he doesn't have a straight. So therefore, anything that 3-bet pre-flop should be, could be bluffing. So let's say this guy has some type of weird missed straight draw, or he has just another random hand. He could be bluffing here. So we actually do see Odd Odson make the call. And given that he called, I think that he could have aces. He could have looked him up lightly with aces. Given his line and depending on what dynamic they have, it's possible that he had some type of flush. But again, I really thought that most of his hands that 4-bet pre, and then if that had a flush draw, would have bet the flop. So I'm curious. I would love to know what Odd Odson have, but that should give you some insight into kind of what they were thinking. in a live game or on most rivers, I wouldn't be potting it here because I think that most people's calling ranges are going to be pretty narrow, and Odd Odson's played it kind of slow, so I don't expect him to have a generally strong range of hands. But they could have a dynamic where potting it looks weaker. So definitely an interesting hand against two guys who clearly have history with each other. And we also see this guy 3-bet under the gun +1. And again, this highlights what I was talking about, where it's a hand that 100 big blinds, I almost guarantee he wouldn't 3-bet. But deep stacked, it becomes better because you have more implied odds, and you have when stacks are this deep with everybody, you actually can call 4-bets profitably, where at 100 big blinds, you can't. So, all right, a lot of cool hands. We talked a lot about deep stack scenarios. If you want to learn more about deep stack scenarios, hey, you can visit the site. There's a lot of good content there. I'll include some links in the comments and in the email here. But of course, you can always email me with questions, not just about deep stacked PLO, but anything PLO oriented. So give me a shout, john@ploquickpro.com. Thanks for checking out the video. Talk to you later, guys. See you next week.